Hello, hello! This is our session number 5, and I'm sorry that it was a little bit delayed, but I was working on a short film actually with Blender, which was really fun, and I also learned so much while doing this. I might send you the link to the video, or to the film, later down the line. Right now it's still in the grading process, and then the sound needs to be made for it, but basically it's done. So I finally have a little bit more time. I'm still catching up with some emails from you guys, so it will all happen this week. In today's session, now you have waited for it for so long, and it's kind of anticlimactic because it's a very, very simple scene. But I do want to talk about a lot of small things here and there. So we will learn how to this session is already long enough. We will learn a whole bunch of things. The example that we will build is fairly simple. And I would say we just get started. And also sorry for this super bright surrounding. When I started the recording, it was a lot darker. And then the sun came out and suddenly it's like... Yeah, and I was just too lazy to get up and walk all the way over to my camera to adjust the ISO settings, because it's very old and it doesn't do that on its own. And I'm very old and too lazy to do that. So, yeah, you will see me super nicely overexposed with perfect skin and almost no shadow under the eyes. Okay, anyways, let's get started. So let's start by talking about what kind of text options we have in Blender. First, in Cinema 4D, we know that we have the Mode Text tool and also the Mode Spline tool in order to create just the splines of the text and do all sorts of things with it. In Blender, it's slightly different. It is a very reduced version of this. But also, to be honest, in Cinema 4D, I never used all the options that the texts give us. I feel like it's nice that it's mode text and that you can place it in a, use it like a cloner, so use all the effectors on it, but it always looks kind of cheap. But maybe it's just me. I'm not a big fan of animating text. It often turns out to be just like, it just feels like PowerPoint presentation transitions, just in 3D, but that doesn't really make it better. So I tend to use a more simplistic approach when working with text and animations, although today we are not talking about animations anyways. So I don't feel like that I'm that much restricted with the text options in Blender. Now in Cinema 4D, it's also not implemented in the perfect way. Remember how we have like this drop down where we can choose the font that we want? This drop down is incomplete. Sometimes it shows fonts in the wrong way. And if you open up the same Cinema 4D file on another machine, and that machine doesn't have the font installed, or the font is different, then Cinema does not give you a warning, and it just shows the font differently, or just goes to the default font, without giving an error or any hint as to which font it was actually using. So, I don't know what the issue there is, but pretty much every 3D application has issues with implementing fonts. And I don't know why, because there are a lot of scenarios where we do want to use fonts in a 3D scene. But, well, I guess they just have their focus somewhere else. So first we will talk about the options that we do have in Blender in order to create our fonts or texts live directly in Blender, but afterwards I will show you how the process is in creating the texts in Illustrator and then moving them over. We've also talked about this in our Cinema 4D course last quarter, and it's even simpler doing it in Blender. So let's take a quick look at our font options here. Let me start by deleting the cube. Oh, by the way, in the bottom left corner, I have added a little plugin that shows the shortcut keys that I press. I hope that this helps, because sometimes I use the shortcut keys and I've gotten so used to them that I might forget to spell them out loud. So I hope that for those instances, the shortcuts in the bottom left corner will help. All right, so I select the cube, then I hit Shift X. You can see it shows Shift X over here. So not Shift X, just X. Didn't I do the same mistake last time as well, where I said Shift X? It doesn't matter. So we get rid of the cube, and then we will look at our add menu. So Shift A, so here's the shift, and we choose our text. Now, the nice thing here is that this text kind of like uses the same logic as a mesh does. So when we create a mesh and we then want to change the vertices, we would hit Tab to go into the edit mode. And here it does the same thing. So when we have our text here, I have it selected. I can't really do anything with the text apart from moving it around, scaling, and the regular things. But when we hit Tab, we now go into edit mode and we can edit the text directly in here, which I think is already an improvement to how Cinema 4D handles it. There we would always have to go to the options of the generator and change the text there, and we need to click outside of the box in order to see the change updated. And here we can just do whatever. I know what you did. I don't know, it doesn't matter. We will not use this anyways. Now, to apply this text, I'll just go outside of this mode, just hit Tab again, and we have our regular text here. Now, with this text, we can do all the things that we can do with other splines as well. So when we go to our text options over here, we have, just like with our path that we created last session, our geometry options, where we can say that we want to have an offset, for instance. So here we can make it thicker or thinner, which is already very convenient. And we can give it some depth by adding an extrusion. Now they also have, like, I don't know, like this is an extrude, sure, but I think it's a little bit confusing that they call this one depth. I mean, it does make sense, it's the depth of the bevel, but I hope that I'm not confusing you when I call this one here depth as well. Officially, it's just an extrusion. So here we can then also add a bevel. Notice, however, that by adding a bevel, our font is getting thicker as well. So always keep that in mind. In the newer versions of Cinema 4D, we do actually have an option to, or even in older versions, to contain the size so that the bevel goes towards the inside. However, depending on the font that you are using, you will get really, really bad artifacts that will literally render your font unusable. So Blender doesn't even give us the option, so we don't have that issue. Here, we just live with the fact that as soon as we add a bevel, it will be added on top of the geometry to make sure that we will always have a clean geometry and not weird overlapping issues. All right. What else do we have? We do have a little bit of a resolution preview here, but generally we don't have issues. The resolution is fine. I mean, you can always drag it down or up if you feel like it makes a difference. Of course, if we drag it down, it makes a difference, but generally the value of 16 gives us a pretty nice and clean font here. Next, we have some paragraph alignments, and oh no, actually next is the font. So for the font, here's where it gets a little bit weird. So we define a font for regular, bold, italic, and bold italic. Usually you just go to the regular, and then you will go to the folder icon, and you need to look for the actual font file. So that is a little bit weird. So it doesn't scan the system fonts by default. I mean, the positive thing about this is you could save the actual font file right next to your Blender file, and that way easily share this file with other people so they can then choose the same font. Whereas in Cinema 4D, other people always need to install the font that they want to use here. But usually, since we're working on our own system and we don't share the file, this feels like a weird extra step. Now let's take a look at where our font files could be installed. I will show it to you right now on a Mac. For Windows, I will show the link as a screenshot kind of thing at the bottom right now, where you can find those font files. All right, so for Mac, we want to go to, there are two different places where font could be installed. The main one is very easy to find. Just go to the library, so make sure that you are on your main hard drive. In my case, it's Macintosh HD. Then you go to library, make sure that you sort it by name, and then you find the fonts. And here you have a list of all of the fonts that you have installed. Now, there might be even more fonts stored in your user folder, but it's in a library that is hidden. Let me show you where to find it. Let's go to our user folder here, and you can see that there's no folder called library because on Mac it's hidden. By the way, you can still get to it even with the Finder by going up here to, I think, Go, but before you click on Go, you hold down the Alt or Option key, and then it gives you the library option. And now you can go to the library of your user folder. Now, this folder exists, but as I said, Mac hides it so that you don't accidentally mess with things that you don't want to mess with. You can still get to it by simply going up here into this path and type in library. And when you hit enter, you enter the hidden folder because it exists, it's just not shown. And here we will also find fonts and font collection. So in here you might find even more fonts that you might want to use. All right. I will just use a default font. So let me just go back here and library fonts. And is there something that catches my eyes? Yeah, let's just take Courier New, just so that we see that something else is happening here. So open font, and now I can see how the font is now being used here. Now the cool thing is, of course, here we can now just hit Tab and edit our text directly in 3D and see what is happening. Okay, oops, Tab to go outside. Now, what else do we have as options? So on the side here, we of course have things like paragraph, we have things like the spacing, and what are actually text boxes? Ah, that's when we have like the overflow things. Yeah, remember how I said in our After Effects course? Well, for the Berlin people, you did not have me in the After Effects course, but maybe Lucas talked about it as well. There are always two types or two ways of creating text, either as a point text or as a paragraph text inside of a box. And the general rule is, or should be, that you don't use paragraph texts, so these text boxes, in applications like After Effects or a 3D application. So I will skip this part. All right, so these are our basic options, and this is a little bit uncomfortable to work with, I think. If we also want to change the original path that we have, I mean, we still could do it in Blender. I could still convert this into actual shapes, scale it around, and match the style the way that I wanted it to. And I will show you roughly how that works, but to be honest, I think it's so much easier in Illustrator, and it's so easy to get your file from Illustrator to Blender that I would just always go that route. Anyways, also, it doesn't have to be Illustrator. In Cinema 4D, it needs to be Illustrator because we need to export a .ai file. However, in Blender, we will import an SVG, which is a more uniform format that you can export with any application. So if you use something like, is Affinity Designer the alternative to Illustrator? Anyways, any vector application can export an SVG, and that is what we need here. But I'm jumping back and forth too much, sorry. But let's quickly take a look at how we could work with the paths here, so we could easily select just a specific part of the font and scale it up. For this, I will first get rid of my geometry options, I think, or can I keep them? I haven't tried this actually. Let me see what happens if I convert it. So in Cinema 4D, we know that we can just hit C to make something editable. Now in Blender, we have a couple of different main things that exist, and we can specifically tell it from where to where we want it to convert. So with our text selected, we will go up here to Object, and then we have the option called Convert To, and here we can see, do we have a curve that we want to create from a mesh or text? Do we want to create a mesh based on curve, meta, or surf or text data? And do we want to create a grease pencil? I will talk about grease pencil another time. So here, what I want is not to create a mesh. I do want to create an actual curve so I can access my curve data. So let's choose this one. And oh my God, this worked so well. It remembered our geometry options. I love Blender. This is so awesome. All right, so now what is different? It looks exactly the same, but we can see that our icon is changed here and also up here. So this is the before, and this is, this is the after. Did I ever talk to you about undos? So you can of course always undo things, Command Z, but if you want to redo something, it's not Command Y, but it's Command Shift Z. I think some Adobe applications have adopted to this as well. After Effects already uses this because Command Y is used to create a new solid, so they also have the Command Shift Z to undo. But, well, now I've mentioned it in session 5. Sorry. So, now that we have a curve text, or a curve, we can hit Tab, and you can now see how we can access our curve elements here. And then we can select the elements here, and we can just scale them up and adjust them to how we want to. And you can see how by scaling up the curve, it does not scale up our extrusion, because the extrusion is applied to the end result of our curve. But scaling this and matching this to the size is of course possible in Blender, but it's also a little bit uncomfortable, I think. So I don't really recommend it. But since I have you here, let me tell you a little bit about more technical options. As I mentioned earlier, this class is a little bit boring, so our end result is kind of nice and clean, but I wanted to use the session to tell you a lot of just like smaller perks. Are perks positive things? I don't know. Smaller things that are good to know in Blender in order to work a little bit more efficiently. So let me take the chance and show you how we can control where we scale things. So if you have also looked at other tutorials in the meantime, in this quarter, you might have heard people talk about the 3D cursor. And I think I also mentioned it in the beginning of the quarter, and back then I was still a little bit confused by it. But it is an extremely useful function. Now, what is the 3D cursor exactly? It is this red thing here, and we can use it for all sorts of things. Essentially, it's just a point in 3D space and nothing more. But this point can be used to align elements. So I think we've already realized, I'm not sure, I think at some point we did it, where we place the 3D cursor in a different spot in order to create objects where the 3D cursor is. Because by default, whenever we create a new cube or any sort of mesh or whatever, it will be created where the 3D cursor is. Now there are different ways of placing the 3D cursor. One of them would be to switch to the cursor mode on the side here and just click somewhere. And now we are placing the 3D cursor. Then whenever we create something, so let me go out of the edit mode and hit Shift A to create something. When I now create a mesh and a circle, for instance, you can see it is created exactly where the 3D cursor is. Now resetting the 3D cursor, I think that is what we did in the beginning of the quarter at some point. Can be a little bit of a hassle. The best way is to remember the shortcut. And the shortcut is Shift S. So let me just undo this. When we hit Shift S, we get a whole lot of options concerning the 3D cursor and things that we can do with it. Also, a couple of other things, but the main ones are connected to the 3D cursor. So let me zoom in here. And what we want to use if we want to reset the 3D cursor is this one here, cursor to world origin. When we do this, the cursor is back at the default position. Now, this 3D cursor can also be used as the point from which we scale. So by default, if I take this entire text and I hit S to scale it, it will already scale from the 3D cursor because I did that earlier. Let me just quickly reset it. By default, it will scale based on the bounding box or based on the actual center of the object. So right now, our center of the object is kind of offset and on the side here. Let me give you a better example. Let's just go back to edit mode, and we have our text selected here, and you can see when we scale it, it will scale from its bounding box center. So this is nice, but what if we wanted to scale from a different point? Here is where we can use the 3D cursor. We could, for instance, go in here and select a point, something in the top left corner. Oops. So select a point, something in the top left corner here, and then we can move our 3D cursor to this exact point by hitting Shift S, and then we say cursor to selected. And now our cursor is exactly on that spot where we have selected the text. Now, another little trick. If we now want to select our text in the middle, it's kind of hard because we easily select more than we wanted to. One solution would be to just select parts of each of the characters that we have. So like this, and then we use the shortcut Command L to select the linked parts. So L like linked, and then Command L to select the linked elements. Now again, by default, if we hit S to scale, it just scales from the bounding box center, which is not what we want. Instead, we will go up here and we will use this little drop down. And here we can tell it to scale from the 3D cursor. So when I now scale this, it scales from the 3D cursor, and that way I have a lot more control. So I could hit GX to move it kind of like into place on the left side here. Looks good. Maybe I go to my top view here, so it's a little bit easier to see. Then I can select my elements on the left, or maybe just a single point here all the way on the left, Shift S, then cursor, to select it. Then I can select my text here, Command L to select the connected ones. I'm still set to scale from the cursor, and then I hit S to scale, and that way I can nicely align it with my text at the top here. The same I could then do with the bottom. Actually, this is too large because this is a little bit offset. Doesn't matter. You get the idea here. Whenever you place the 3D cursor somewhere, I always recommend resetting it back to the origin, because it can be confusing if you create new objects and they are placed at a random position. Even though it's not random, of course, but it just feels a little bit random. So after you're done with your 3D cursor and what it should have done, you use the Shift S shortcut again, and then you say cursor to the world origin. Now, there are even more cool things that we can do, that we can control. Let's say, for instance, we have a couple of different objects that we create. So let me hit Shift A and let me create a cube, a UV sphere, and a monkey head. So let's move them to different places. Oops. Now, when we want to scale them, by default, they will scale based on the center of the bounding box. So when I hit S and scale, and I go back to the default option here, you can see how it finds kind of like a shared center point and will scale the elements from there. What if we want to scale all these elements based on their own origins? So you can see an object has an origin, which is this little dot here, and we can control from where it should scale by going here and then say that it should use the individual origins. when we now scale this, all these elements are scaling on their own. The position stays intact, and we literally just change the scale of each object individually. Then we also have, like, the other ones are not that important. The median point is very similar to the bounding box, so I would just skip this. The active element, however, is one more thing that is quite interesting. And it's also something that we could have used instead of the origin, the 3D cursor. Now, you might have already noticed that one element is always different than the others. So here, for instance, it's the monkey head, and it's this brighter yellow color in the outline. And this is pretty much just like in Illustrator, where we can tell elements to be kind of like the master to which other elements should be aligned. I will try to remember to show this as well when we open up Illustrator. So essentially, the last element that you select is the master, and we can see it here as well. So everything gets kind of like bluishly highlighted, but the last one is highlighted more. And here we can then say that the active element should be used as the reference. So when we now scale this, you can see how it scales from the monkey head. And also rotation will happen from the monkey head, and everything else is connected. This is not parenting. We'll talk about parenting in a moment. This is just a temporary thing. So afterwards, if I now just select one element and I rotate it, you can see they are completely independent. Now, what if we have selected multiple elements just by clicking and dragging? And somehow we want now the box here to be our master element. Quite simple. Hold down Shift, click on the element that should be the master, and it will be made the active element. Depending on which mode you are in, and some other reasons that I have not quite figured out yet, Shift is also used to deselect something. So if I hold down Shift and I click on it again, I would deselect this element. So it's important to kind of like be mindful of that Shift does these two things. It defines which object is the active one, but it can also deselect something. And that is when things get a little bit confusing. So just try to click a couple of times and then you should get there. All right, now I wanted to have my cube here as my master, just to show. And when we now rotate, we are rotating around the cube. All right, now to get all of this back to the default settings, just go up here and switch our transforms back to the bounding box center, and then it behaves just like it did before. Right now it scales a little bit weird because I have the light source back here selected as well. So let me just shift click on the, let me just not select the light. Oh, wait, sorry. Over here, let me also show it to you. It's not the shift key, it's the command key, where you can then also define what should be the master, and by clicking on it a second time, you deselect it. All right, so now everything is back to how it was before. Whoosh. All right, so enough talking about theoretical things and things that are practical, even though these things are very practical, being able to control from where something should scale. But let's talk about how we can create this text actually in Illustrator. So let me head over there. So in Illustrator, I said so again. In Illustrator, we will go to Create New, and I generally start with a web preset here. You can also go, if it's not shown here already, go to Web and then choose the Web Large preset, which then gives us a canvas of 1920 by 1080, which is already a good place to start. It is RGB, although it doesn't matter, colors are not converted over to Blender anyways, just the shapes. So here we choose what we want, then let's wait for this to open, and start adding our text. So T for the text tool, just click, and then we type in, I know what you did. I was initially planning on do this last week already, but I realized that then our recording would have gone way too long, so I decided to push it over here. But that's why it's still a little bit Halloween themed, you know? I know what you did last summer. That's just where it comes from. Anyways. So I have my text here, I scale it up, make sure to hold down Shift to constrain the proportions. And did it mess it up already? Click and drag, Shift. I feel like it stretches it. Is it just me? Maybe. Then, no, I don't care what's new in Illustrator. Go away. Then, in the properties, I can choose a nice font. So let me use something like, oh, this is good. Something really bold. And to adjust the sizes of my text here, the best option is to just make this one editable. So we would go to Object. I think I only know the shortcut. No, Edit. No, Type. There it is. Type and then Create Outlines. I usually only remember Command-Shift-O. So create outlines, and now our text is converted into, well, regular paths, so that we now have the option to scale them individually. First, I would ungroup them. So when we take a look at our layers up here, we can see that this is just one group. To ungroup, you simply hit Command-Shift-G. I think I will just show you the shortcut here, because Command-G to group is pretty self-explanatory. It's the same as in Photoshop as well, and Command-Shift-G just undoes this. So Command-Shift-G to ungroup it, and we can now see how these are all individual. Now maybe to make our lives a little bit easier, let's just select each line and group them together. So when we want to scale them, it's just easier. All right, then we can start aligning them. So here I would start with a W, and then I just align it here. Maybe I hit Command R to get a ruler so I can see the right side here as well. Now, if there's some art directors here that are like, oh, Leonard, you can't just align the tip of the W with the line of the I here. You need to find the visual place. I am not an art director. I'm not even a graphic designer. I'm something else. So if you want to go for the visual alignment, you do whatever. I will stick to this. So I will align it here. I will not even align it super perfectly, just by eye. I mean, in the end, it's 3D and people don't see it that much anyways in the end. So here, there we go, looks close enough. And then this needs to be scaled down quite a bit. I think this is good enough for me. Now I can get rid of the guide. I think I can't select it here in Illustrator. Oh, I can. I can get rid of the guide, and I can start adding a little bit more spacing between the letters, because you might remember if we want to add a bevel around it, it will make our font thicker. And thicker also means that it gets a little bit higher. So when we add our bevel, it might mean that we get some overlaps here. So I don't want it to be too tight. Of course, we can always change the spacing later on in Blender as well, but I would like to already have a good place to start. So let's just, I would think I just move this down and see how well they will align if I select all of them here. Then let's go to, is it under properties? Yeah, go to the align options and tell them to distribute. So we do have align options, but they would not place them at equal distances from one another. It would just mean that everything would be aligned to the top or the bottom of our selection. That's not what we want right now. What we want is something called distribute objects, and here we want them to be distributed like this, a vertical distribute center. So when I do this, it will automatically detect the distances and set them equally. Although I gotta say, I don't feel like that this worked too well. I mean, theoretically, it does this, but when I look at the distance here, like the O is the highest point, and then I look at the distance here, I mean, we saw that it did something. So if something is like completely off, like this, and we do it, it kind of gets us where we want to be, but apparently it's not perfect. But I have had good results with this function in other scenarios where we just have cubes, for instance. So just as an example, let's say we have, not cubes, a bunch of rectangles here. So let me just duplicate it, duplicate it over like this, and let's pretend that these are our kind of random whatever, and we want to align them to the straight line that we just had earlier. We would first say that they should be aligned to their center, and then we can distribute them, in this case, horizontally. And here we now have really nice, perfect, even spacing. Just not with these ones here for some reason. I guess it doesn't really look at the boundary, it just looks at the center point. And because this line is higher than this one, because of the O, the center point is also a little bit higher, and that is why the text is too high up. That actually makes sense, but still, you would expect it to be a little bit smarter than it actually is. Now, since I'm here, I told you that I will tell you a little bit about alignment options that we have in Illustrator. So, in Illustrator, we can also define an active object. So let's say we have all these random things, and we want to say everything should be aligned based on this element over here. We could just click on it, and you can see how it gets this additional outline. And when we now say that everything should be aligned to the center, it will be aligned to the center of this element. This can also be used if you want to align other objects to one main one. So let's say I have an ellipse, let's just give it a different color, and I want it to be exactly where this one is. Of course, I could move it and hope that I will get some snapping somewhere. Apparently I turned my snapping off. But the alternative is just select both elements, define this as your master, and then tell it to be aligned vertically and horizontally. And now our sphere is exactly in the center of that master object. So very, very useful function in Illustrator, and as we've seen in Blender, it has the same logic of being able to define a master element that is then used, in that case, for scaling. And here it's used for alignments. In Photoshop, unfortunately, we do not have that option. We only can use a selection, kind of like as a master, but like an actual marquee selection, for instance. Yeah, I feel like other programs are doing these sort of things better than Photoshop. Anyways, let's get rid of this. Today is a lot of quick tips here and there. Let's go back to this, and I feel like I'm pretty fine with this. Now, you don't need to align it perfectly in the scene, because in your 3D scene it will be at some place somewhere anyways. So it doesn't matter to align it here or scale it to some place. Just, we have a basic canvas, and it just needs to be on there somewhere, and then we're good. Now, we can take this and save this as an SVG. So, in In Illustrator, if we want to export something for Cinema 4D, you might remember it's saved as an .ai file, a.ai file, and it needs to be version Illustrator 8. So it's something that you need to remember, like not just AI, but it needs to be a very specific version. For Blender, much easier, it just needs to be an SVG. So here, under Format, we choose SVG. I have not tried to use the compressed version, but it does not have to be compressed. I mean, these files will not be large anyways. So let's go to SVG, and let's call this one No. And save. And okay. Alright, let's now head over to Blender and let's just get rid of all of that stuff here that we don't need. And let's import something. We will go up here to File, then Import, and then we will choose the Scalable Vector Graphics. See, now you even know what SVG stands for. Isn't this nice? We learned so much today. So we choose this, and we now find our file. So let's go to the desktop and choose our SVG, and then choose Import. And now we can see how it is imported here. Now by default, it is very, very small. So we probably could have taken a larger canvas in Illustrator, but I don't care. We can just always scale it up later, so I don't mind. What I often like to do is, we can kind of see based on our scene here with the camera and the light how large it should be. I usually select it and I hit S to scale it up, and then do this a couple of more times until I have kind of like a proper scale. And then I create a reference object, so for instance a cube, so I can see, yeah, this looks like it is roughly in the same size, so it's an appropriate size to work in. So we can delete the cube again. Now one thing that we realize is that we have all of these different curves that we actually don't need. They can all be merged into one, and they all have their center point somewhere over here where we don't want it. So they don't have their center point on each letter. It's all a shared point that is over here. So let's first see a functionality of how we could fix it in general if we wanted to keep them separate and have their own axes. So let's select all of them, make sure that the light is not selected. So I clicked on it twice, shift clicked on it twice. Then we can go to Object, Set Origin, and we can say that we want to move our origin to the geometry. We could have also said to move it to the 3D cursor. See, another way where the 3D cursor could be used. But in this case, it should detect of each of the curves that we have where the center of this is, and the origin should be moved there. Now we can see, let me hit period. Now we can see how they have all of their own points or origins from which we could scale them and adjust the shape if we wanted to. Now what I actually want is all of this stuff to be in the center. Now let's see if we can use our 3D cursor for this. Let's select all of them, then hit Shift S and say Selection to Cursor. This did not work exactly the way that I wanted it to. But we can see how at least everything moved to the cursor. So that is already one step closer to where I want it to be. Okay, let's just undo this. Apparently, when using this function, all of this is just acting like individual elements. And it doesn't matter what we've chosen up here. So the Shift S and then Selection to Cursor just does this. Actually, there's this function here. Oh my god, this works amazing. Literally, I wanted to show you a different way of doing this, but this is so cool. Have I said already today that I love Blender? Sorry, so there's the Selection to Cursor and Keep Offset option as well. I've never seen this one. How did I not see this? Anyways, but this does exactly what we want. Another solution would have been to merge them together. So to merge them together, we will go to Object, and then it's called Join. And here we can now see how everything is highlighted, and here we can also see how everything is merged together. It's kind of like in Cinema 4D when we have the Connect and Delete option. And now that all of this is one thing, which is what we want in the end anyways, we would hit Shift S and then we say selection to cursor, and now it's nicely in the center over here. Alrighty. Now that we have our text here, let's actually start talking about how to get this into the look that we want. First up, we want to rotate it so that it looks sideways. It's always more comfortable to place a camera this way because at the top here, it's kind of a little bit harder to get the rotation the way that we want it to, and it's a lot easier to get our rotation right from here because it's already aligned on one of the axes. So we just need to get kind of like the placement of the camera right. So let's select our object, hit R for the rotation, X to constrain it to the X-axis, move it around until we realize, okay, so in the top left corner we can see we are moving it into a positive direction. We type in 90 and hit enter. Now that our text is placed, we can extrude it a little bit. For this, we will go over here to the geometry and the extrude. Now, as soon as we extrude it, we realize that it will extrude a lot. And the reason is that the original path is a lot smaller. Now, usually there are a couple of ways of applying our scale to make sure that these things behave that we want it to. And one option would be to go up here, then go to apply and then choose scale. But for some reason, for curves, this does not work. It does reset our scale up here. So usually when we scale something, you can see how this value is changing, and we can always reset it to the original scale that it has. See, I applied earlier, so it's back to 1. But for these ones here, or at least for this geometry option, this does not work. So the information of how much it should extrude is somewhere stored on the inside, and I've already Googled it, and there doesn't seem to be a solution for this. Which means that we just need to work with values that are a whole lot smaller than we would expect them to be. So I recommend holding down the Shift key and moving it down, and if you are not getting the values that you want, you can even go in smaller increments, so you could also type in 0035. You can see there are more decimal places available if necessary. But I think a value of 4 is, or 004 is actually quite good, especially since I can still move it back and forth across the plane that will be the background. Speaking of which, let's hit Shift A, go to Mesh, and create a plane, hit R, X, 90, S for scale. There we go. I think this should look quite alright. And let's add our light. I would also just quickly switch to Eevee just so that we can see how our light will be behaving. Later on, we will, however, use cycles to render because it will look nicer. But with Eevee, at least we already get a nice preview of what our shadows will look like. So here I can see right now my light source is all the way in the back, which is something that I don't want, of course. So I go to my side view, kind of, select the light, hit G, and move it to the front somewhere here. And apparently it needs to be a whole lot closer. So let's hit G and Y to move it closer here. And we can see how our shadows are getting longer and longer and longer. So I think I want something like this. Maybe this is already too much. Maybe like this. Now the shadows in Eevee are a little bit inaccurate right now, but that's fine because I will not use Eevee in the end anyways. Now let's first talk about our materials. Let's switch to our shading options here. Yep. By the way, even though we are in the shading view here, you can also switch over to Eevee in order to get the actual light setup that we will have later. Then we will go to our plane, that is our background, and in our default slot we add a new material. This will add the principled BSDF. I always forget the D. Principled BSDF. And I think the default color and everything is totally fine. I want something that is pretty white, And it should also be pretty matte. So I might want to increase the roughness, although the roughness is already pretty high. It's already at 0.5. I think we will just keep the white material as it is. Then to our object here, we will apply another material. So apparently it already created one for the SVG material thing, but we will just create or use our own material, which is this one. Let's actually rename this to white, so we know a little bit better which one is which. Okay. Then we want a different material just for the parts that we have here, and that is also fairly simple to do. First, we would make a selection. So let's hit Tab and just select our paths in the center. Hit Command L to select the connected ones, the linked elements. Then we will add another slot. So here we will add another slot. Here we assign our selection to that slot, and we will just create a new material and we give it a different color. Chip. So something like this. Yeah, let me zoom in a little bit more. I think I want it to be really red. Always remember, don't use a purely saturated color. Always go a little bit less. And also don't go to a pure white. Always go a little bit less, just to make sure that we will get more realistic renders in the end. All right, now that we have this, we can select this and let's add a little bit more of a bevel here. So we will go to our curve options, to the geometry, and in the bevel, and here we need to use something extremely tiny. So let's go up here and we can see this is already way too much. Let's try 0.1. Still a little bit too much. Let's try 0.5. This looks better. I just want a really small bevel just to get these highlight edges to really emphasize that we have a 3D scene here. But I really don't want it to be too strong. I think this should work just fine. Now to align our camera perfectly to the center, let's enable our camera view here. Hit N for Nelly, go to the side and make sure that we are locking our camera to the view. Now we are able to move the camera around roughly into position. Then we make sure that the camera is selected, go to the item, and we figure out which locations we need to center. So apparently the Y position is how far away it is from our object. So here we can also drag it like this, which means that the X and the Z defines where it will be centered. Now it looks like it's completely off, but that just has to do with the rotations. So here we can see, apparently we want to go to pretty round numbers, so something like 0 or 90 or 180. So here, these two obviously should be 0, and this one is closest to 90, so let's set it to 90. And now we can see how our camera is perfectly centered and aligned with our text that we have here. Now, finally, let's adjust our zoom level here until we're happy. Let's see what this looks like in cycles. Also, whenever we switch the render engines, while we are in this view, it could cause crashes, so let's make sure that we save this file. Let's go to desktop and let's give this a name. I just stick the I know. All right, so up here we will go to the camera icon, which is our render settings, and here we will switch it to cycles. And we can see, alrighty, some things are already happening. We do get this really nice effect of a bright light hitting the top of our text, and then it emits indirect light and fills up our scene here, which really gives it this clean 3D look. But our shadows need to be a whole lot softer, and I also feel like it needs to be brighter and smoother overall. And we all do that with lights. First, let's go to our main light here, go to the light options, and I think we don't change the power. We will keep it at 1000 watts for now, but we change the radius. Let's try something much larger, like 1 meter. And we can see, we're getting there. Now we do want to play around with it a little bit. Let's just add another side here. By the way, I saw a video where someone just dragged something out without the split thing, which was so cool. I mean, I know that I can drag something out by going up here. So, a little quick tip. Instead of right-clicking and telling it to split, you can also use these ones here to add new things, but you can't use this to collapse it. But I saw in a video that someone did this. So let me see. Is there a shortcut? Command clicking down? No. Shift clicking down? Alt clicking down? It looked so cool. I was like, how did he do that? Because the right-clicking and join areas is like such a specific place where you need to right-click. And I think on a trackpad, it's a little bit uncomfortable. But he merged it somehow, and that was so cool. I want that too. Okay. Well, let me just join the area here, and this one here as well, just to show you again. So another option, instead of right-clicking and saying that it should be vertical or horizontal split, you can also go into this tiny area up here until this plus icon appears, and then you can click and drag it over in order to create a vertical split here, or a horizontal split if you drag it up from the bottom. What? This dragged it out? So what is the rule here? When does it know when to collapse? So here it doesn't let me drag out another one. Okay. And if I change this, it just drags out another one. And what if I do this? Then it would merge it. And if I do this, it adds a new one. And here it adds a new one. What is the rule here? When does it... Now I've created a whole bunch of shit. Damn it. Huh. I don't get the rule. Do you get the rule when it does create a new one and when it doesn't? This is... I thought I figured it out, but I didn't. Huh. Well, let's now just join them together, join them together, join them together. This is taking so much time. Join them together, and finally, there we go. Whew. I really wish I understood how this joining works in this nicer way. But anyways, alright, so over here I might want to get a little bit closer. So I hit N for Nelly, go to my view, and then I disable the camera to view, because this way I don't want to move the camera closer. I do like the way that it's framed. I don't like, however, how small this frame is in my viewport. So by unlocking the camera, we are now able to zoom just our viewport and not the position of the camera. As soon as I rotate, however, I go outside of the camera, but I can always go back and it remembers this placement that we had. So here I can now place it the way I wanted to. Here on this side, making sure that I'm not in the camera, so I unlock this from the view so I can rotate around. And I can take my light and hit G and Y to move it. So it's a little bit closer. So the shadow is closer, the light is further away. And I think I want it to be even softer. So let's go to the light and try something like 2 meters. What about 3? Yes, I like it. Okay. Next, I want my scene overall to be brighter, and I don't want my shadows to be so dark. By adding more light to the surrounding, our shadows will be lifted up in its darkness. That sounded really dark. So let's go down here to our world options and just change the color of the background. So here, just increase it, and by giving the world more light, our entire scene gets a whole lot lighter, and we now get this really nice, super soft and super clean effect. I do think I want my text to be a little bit further apart, so let me just hit Tab, select these ones, Command L, and then maybe let's do it over here so we can see it a little bit better. And then G, Z to move it down a little bit. And then we will do the same thing for the top. Command L, GZ, and move it up a little bit, just so that we don't get super dark shadows here, because that kind of like kills the clean vibe. Okay. There we go. Now we just play a little bit around with the brightness. I think my light here can be a little bit brighter. Let's try something like 1500. Maybe 2000. Nice and clean and bright. And let's also play a little bit with the colors of our lights. I think this can be even softer. Let's try 4. Yeah. Oh. I like it. Maybe now it can be a little bit closer. How large is it based on the distance? Oof, it's already intersecting with our plane there. No, I think I keep the light there. I don't want to overdo it too much. All right, so what did I want to do? Oh yeah, play a little bit with colors, because right now it's very white and clean, and that's okay. But what could make it even nicer is if we play around with slight color differences. Maybe work with the contrast of blue and yellow or orange. So let's go to our world and actually tint this just ever so slightly. Just like here. Just so that we have a little bit of a blue. You can even hold on Shift to move it in even smaller increments. Just so this is a little bit colder, and then we make the light a little bit warmer. So we will, again with the we will go to the light, to the color, and here also, ever so slightly give it an orangey tint. Yes, I like it. Maybe a little bit more, but not overdoing it. And here a little bit more too. Just a little bit. Why am I whispering? Because I'm doing small changes. There we go. See how this now feels completely different? Like before it was just white, and it felt a little bit pale. And now with the two colors that we're using, we give this a lot more feeling, a lot more depth to it. It's just a very, very subtle effect, but I think that it makes a huge difference. Alrighty. And that is already it. A lot of talking about other things. So you can see that the actual project here is very, very simple and small. I mean, we could have done this in like 15 minutes. But I did want to show you a couple of different options that we have in Blender, along with some small tricks here and there. Alright, so for the proof of attendance, send me just the render of this or a screenshot. All good there, so keep it simple. And for the homework, I want you to not do this. I feel like people are taking, like when I say use the techniques that we used in this class, they take it very literal. And well, I'm not saying everyone, but some of you are staying pretty close to what we did in the class. And I feel like that is a little bit too simple. You should be exploring more things, and you should think about, okay, so I've learned something, I've learned a technique, and how can I apply it to another scene or another example? So for instance, in our last session, when we had like this tube thing with the rings, people just built more tubes with rings. And I was just thinking, it's okay, but wouldn't it be nicer if you think about, okay, so what else could I use this technique of using an array to duplicate things? Or what else could I use this technique of taking geometry and wrapping around another part? It doesn't even have to be a ring that we then align to a tube or something. There are so many different ways of using this. So what I want you to do is not work with text and not work with a setup that is this flat. So these are the things that you are not allowed to use. What I do want you to use, however, is Illustrator, create some path, or take something that you already have. Could be a logo, could be an illustration. Just keep in mind that we cannot export colors. Well, we can assign colors, but don't do something that is too complex. Try to think of the places or the examples where you could apply the techniques that we've learned today. So, use Illustrator, export an SVG, put it into Blender, use the separate parts of this, place them around, and create a 3D scene out of this. Additionally, I do not want to see a background. So this is your challenge. Right now, we don't see a background because we have a wall. So you could also think, okay, so maybe I could use a wall. Or maybe you want to use, like we did in cinema, a bend deformer. Have we talked about a bend deformer? Let me quickly show it to you. So let's see how that could work. Let's first get rid of the plane here. I'll just hide it. And let's add a grid, because with a grid we can already find what resolution we want to have. So I would take 100 by 100 here. Then let's scale this up a little bit. And if we want to add this bend, like we do in cinema, it works a little bit differently, but it still works. I mean, we could also just do it by using a subdivision surface, but I will show you this way. With the grid selected, we will go to our modifiers, and we will use something that is called a simple deform. Here we have an option to bend it, and we can tell it from which axis it should bend. For some reason, it doesn't work so well on a grid because the rotations are kind of weird. The simplest solution is to, just like with other deformers, define where the origin should be. So let's, again with the so, I have issues. Let's just add a plane axis, then choose that one as our object. And when we now take this empty and we rotate it around, you can see how we are affecting how this is behaving. So let's try rotating it around the x-axis, and we can see, aha. So apparently as soon as we do this, it kind of works. So it just needs something, some sort of information, how it should start. So let's try to set this rotation here to 90. And let's go back to the grid, and let's add the angle to 90, and let's add a restriction to start here. No, the other way around, right? Yeah, the other way around. So this is 0, and this should be 0.5. All right, and now we have a nice 90-degree angle bend here that starts exactly in the center, so we can always scale it up and move it down a little bit, so G and Z to move it down, so that our text is here. And you can see how our super bright setup works also very, very nicely in a scene like this here. All right, so to recap, use Illustrator, create something in there, export it as an SVG, import it into Blender. Do not place it just on a flat surface. I want you to place it around in 3D space. I do want you to use, however, a super nice smooth setup like we have here, with a bright sky, a large light, soft shadows, and use cycles to render. All right. I'm excited to see what you come up with. And again, don't use text. Be smarter. See you then.